Today is May 17th, and this is a continuation of the previous chapter describing my return to Minneapolis and my beginning of work at the Communication Center. One of the more interesting projects that we did shortly after I returned to Minneapolis and started working at the Communication Center was to get involved with a group that was opposing redlining by banks and insurance companies in South Minneapolis. That was originally an area called the Model City neighborhood, but became clear over time that we had to attack this problem not only in Minneapolis but in St. Paul. And we linked up with an organization in St. Paul headed by a gentleman by the name of Bill Grace, who was a disciple of Saul Alinsky. So as we began to provide support services and coordinate with the, I think it was called the Center for Community Change in St. Paul, it was suggested to us that we have a mass meeting and invite Saul Alinsky to come to Minneapolis, which we did. So one evening, we had a well-publicized meeting, a speech by Saul Alinsky at Sabathani Community Center, arranged by Bill Grace, and we arranged to videotape the address. Saul was being introduced by Harry Davis, who was at the time the president of the Minneapolis NAACP, and a friend of Saul's, and we had an opportunity. I had, as a staff member of the Communication Center and kind of the producer of the show, I had the opportunity to have dinner with Saul and some of the other organizers who were working on this project. So as it turned out, we recorded the meeting and Saul's speech to probably, I'm guessing, 300 or 400 people at Sabathani in their auditorium. And afterwards, he announced that he was going to Marion, Ohio to give a speech there, and then was heading out to California for some rest and recreation. What we later found out was this was probably the last piece of video, the last recorded speech that Saul Alinsky ever gave, because shortly thereafter, when he was out in California, he passed away of a heart attack. So I have in my files the video that we made in 1972 of Saul Alinsky's last speech. We were successful, I think, in getting some legislation passed that helped to prevent redlining by banks and insurance companies, and so the effort was worth doing. But the Communication Center continued to struggle after that. As I mentioned previously, we had financial troubles, and we were warned by the city government and by the Model City administration that we could not expect to continue to overspend our budget. So finally, when we did, the board of directors had a meeting, and they invited Ron Washington, the executive director, to the meeting and told him that they were going to relieve him of his duties. And it was clear, because of the possibility that we were going to lose our funding, that we had to change course dramatically. There were other issues that came up related to Ron, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, but one of the ones was Ron had a tendency to, I think, be attracted to some of the women who worked in the office, in particular to one that he hired from Boston, from the Boston Model City program, called Gail Wilson. Gail was had moved to Minneapolis. Her father was working as the executive chef at the Friars Dinner Theater in downtown. And Gail and I found that after working together for several months that we were attracted to one another, and we started seeing each other. And so Gail's father, Tony, would invite us, kind of gave us a blank check whenever we wanted to come to the Friars Dinner Theater to come down and have dinner and see the show. And it was an interesting opportunity because the actors that they brought into Friars were generally old television stars or people who had movie careers. And I remember meeting Imogene Coca and her husband, King Donovan. Imogene Coca had been a star with Sid Caesar in early television, and King Donovan was a noted character actor, and the two of them did a play called The Four Poster, I remember, and I remember having dinner with the two of them at Tony's house. Also met Richard Deacon, who was one of the co-stars of the Dick Van Dyke Show, and met a couple of other interesting people. One of the actors who had been in the Laugh-In television show that was very popular for a few years. His name was Alan Zeus. But at any rate, what happened at the communication center was that Ron was fired by the board, and they decided that they were going to either close the center or see if it could be saved. And they talked to Tom Miles, who was one of the senior staff members, and to me about whether either one of us would be interested in trying to organize a mission to save the center. And I think both of us agreed that we would try, and out of the interviews they chose me as the interim executive director to try to figure out how to do this. So working with the staff members who were still there, and a number of them had been laid off or had quit, I went through the center, and we reduced every expense, taking out water coolers and extra phone lines and everything we could to narrow down the budget deficit. And we finally came close to the end of the budget year, but we were out of money. And so what we did was we asked staff members who were willing to go on unemployment compensation for a month and continue to work to keep the center open, with the understanding that when the new fiscal year started in July 1st, we would start meeting payroll again and paying staff members. And that's pretty much what happened. We probably had 8 or 10 staff members who agreed to stay, and the center became very much refocused. We began to create new services, and we began to attract clients not only from the model neighborhood but from around the city, and eventually around the metro area, and finally around the state. And we began to become a management assistance center, which meant that we developed services to help nonprofits manage better their resources. So we were doing everything from board and staff training to fundraising to communication services, and we developed a phone-in dictation word processing service, and and we were finding that we were attracting some national attention. I got a visit one day from a program officer from the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation in Flint, Michigan, who had heard about us and wanted us to work with them on a program they called Stimulating the Neighborhood Action Process. It was a program they had in 11 cities around the country, and we were going to be their support center for the 11 programs. So we were given a pretty substantial grant to make that happen, and that proved to be a very interesting and successful program. through the Mott Foundation and developed a good relationship with Norwood Roussel and the staff at the Mott Foundation, which brought me to Flint, Michigan for a couple of meetings. I met the president of the foundation and a couple of other program officers, relationships that continued throughout the years. And in addition to that program, we helped to organize the National Nonprofit Management Association along with the Support Center from Washington, D.C., and the Detroit Accounting Aid Society, and the SCORE project from Indianapolis. And we started to really look at the whole issue of better management of nonprofit organizations. So the Communication Center, while it continued to get support from the city of Minneapolis now through community development block grant funds, was developing programs to help neighborhoods communicate better. We designed everything from letterheads and business cards for these neighborhood organizations and helped them start their own community newspapers and publish those, and became pretty well known throughout Minneapolis for doing that, and valued by most of the city council, and so we continued to get funding through CDBG. Sometime during that time, I hired another current friend and colleague, Bob Zeller, who has continued to work on media projects now in Spokane, and has been doing an oral history of the counterculture. Bob is a very creative guy, and I have several pieces of material that he has produced. Gail and I continued to see each other. Things were very serious for a while, and then Gail decided to move back to Boston, and that sort of ended that relationship, although she was dating a guy before she left, and became pregnant by this guy who is a doctor or a medical student from the University of Minnesota, I believe. And so she had a child, and we continued to stay in touch, and have reconnected on a friendship basis over the years. But I did stay in touch with many of the people from the Communication Center, and we had a reunion about 3 or 4 years ago, and many of them attended that reunion. It was a great event, and one that I enjoyed very much. The Communication Center had one problem from its early days, and that was financial management. And so at one point in about 1973, I had lost the woman that had been my office manager and had to hire someone to replace her. And I had placed an ad in the Minneapolis papers and in the Model City paper, and about 2 weeks after I filled the position, a man walked in and asked me if the position had been filled, and I said it had been, and he gave me his resume and said he'd like to help out if he could. His name was Al Bilheimer, and when I looked at Al's resume, I was pretty shocked because he had a master's degree from Harvard in business, an MBA from Harvard. He had an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering from Purdue University and had worked for a number of major IT companies, including Control Data and TRW. So I was so curious as to why he would be applying for a $12,000 a year job as an office manager, and he explained to me that he was finishing up his treatment at Northwestern Hospital's Alcoholic Treatment Center. He was in a halfway house that Northwestern operated, and he didn't want to go back into the corporate world because he thought he might start drinking again. He said he had lost his job, his house, his his family virtually everything, and he was very afraid of relapsing. So I proposed to Al that he take over our accounting, which he said he thought he could do, and he not only did it, but he did it so well that the people in the finance department at City Hall, when they started getting our financial reports, couldn't figure out why they were suddenly so complete and accurate and pristine. And I explained to them that we had a new staff member doing these, and they said to me, any possibility you could do the same for Harriet Tubman Women's Shelter. I said I thought we could, and I sent Al over to meet with the executive director of that organization, and in short order he had them all fixed up, and then he was, I think, taking on the Urban League Street Academy and a couple of other programs, and pretty soon he was doing the books for 4 or 5 model city organizations that all had financial difficulties. So it became clear that we had the possibility of a very needed service here, and the city would value that service. So after we continued to grow and take on more accounting clients, we applied to one of the local foundations for a grant. I think it was McKnight Foundation, for a grant to purchase a computer so we could put all this new financial business we were doing on computer. We got the grant, and Al hired a second accountant, and before long we were at 10 and then 20 and 30 accounting clients or financial management clients. And I believe when I left in 1969 to go to graduate school, 1979 to go to graduate school, I think the total number of clients that our community administrative services, as we called it, had was upwards of maybe 100 clients that we were doing the books for. 100 different nonprofit organizations were contracting with us to provide accounting and financial management services. So that had really grown to be something substantial. When I left to go to graduate school in 1979, I had actually planned on going the year previous, but personal circumstances made that unlikely and difficult, and so I decided to go in 79. And I resigned as the executive director of the Model City Communication Center, then, which we had changed the name to Minneapolis Communication Center. And they hired a woman as the executive director. Unfortunately, that didn't work out so well, and after a couple of years, the organization lost its funding, and the only thing that continued in a very respectable way for years after that was the Community Administrative Services that Al Billheimer had founded and was running so well. And I'm not sure how many years that continued after I left, but I think it was at least 10 years and probably would have gone on longer than that. But Al, I believe, had a heart attack and died unexpectedly and at a fairly early age. So I was off to graduate school in 1979, moved back to Pittsburgh, and I was very happy to get back into academia. And the next chapter will talk about graduate school and the Community Technical Assistance Center and the program to create a community education program in Pittsburgh.